Hello, welcome back to my series of lectures on the Old Testament and the surrounding world. In the first of the video series, we learned about the Sumerian civilization. We talked about the two types of writing styles, the cuneiform writing styles that come from that time period. We talked a little about the base 60 mathematics, and we learned about Enheduanna, the oldest known author in human history. We also talked about the Epic of Gilgamesh and the tablet relating the Sumerian flood story, and we saw a chart on some of the different belief systems around the planet that have their own flood stories also. I showed you how the Old Testament was able to give us a clue to putting Abram in the timeline of human history by referring to where he was from as Ur the Chaldees and what that meant. Then I showed you the ruins of Haran, admittedly 1,000 years after Abram, but I still thought it was interesting. We learned about Haran through the ages, how it lasted until the Mongols destroyed it in 1250 AD. Then we followed Abram and his family down into Canaan. We didn't get to learn or see too much about Canaan from Abram's day, but we did get to see what the people looked and dressed like from the Beni Hassan tomb paintings and hieroglyphic writings in Egypt. Since Abram and his clan left Canaan during this time of famine for Egypt, that's where I'm going to take you this class. The Egyptian civilization is the longest lasting civilization in human history. It lasted roughly 3,000 years, and I need to ask you to bear with me while I try to cover 3,000 years of history in 2 short video classes. I'm going to note a few different things about the different time periods in Egyptian history rather quickly, and then I'll spend some more time in the second part of the class on some specific things from Egyptian history. The first thing to know about ancient Egypt is that the only reason civilization could exist there is because of the Nile River. The Nile River flows from south to north, and with clock-like regularity, it floods its banks. This flooding allows for 2 crops per year, making it the breadbasket of the ancient world. In times of famine, ancient peoples would go to Egypt, and even in the glory days of Rome, Egypt would send massive barges of grain to Rome so the Roman citizens could receive their daily bread allotment. Just like how America has been called the breadbasket of the modern world, so was ancient Egypt. The first pharaoh credited with uniting the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt was the pharaoh Narmer, and he did that around 3100 BC. He started and ruled the pre-dynastic or prehistoric period of Egyptian history. Before I talk more about him, I'm going to give you a second to try to guess the name of the last pharaoh in the ancient Egyptian civilization. Just shout out your guess to the TV. You won't feel any more stupid than I am asking a question to a video camera. I'm hoping that you guessed that Elizabeth Taylor, aka Cleopatra, was the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra VII, she was the last in the line of Egyptian pharaohs that go back 3,000 years in time. This is an actual bust of Cleopatra found in Alexandria, which was the capital of Egypt at that time, and it currently resides in the Berlin Museum. I do want to take a second to point out to you that you are closer in time to Cleopatra than she was to the Great Pyramids. Egypt had 30 plus dynasties in its long history, and just try to compare that to Sumeria with the 3 dynasties it had in the length of its civilization. The early dynastic period of Egypt starts with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, like I said. Upper Egypt is considered upriver, which would be the end of Egypt to the south, and Lower Egypt would be the part of Egypt down near the Mediterranean. Before the unification of Egypt, the land was settled with autonomous villages. Everything was self-rule. With the early dynasties and much of Egypt's history later, after Narmer unified the country, it became known as two lands. The kings, aka pharaohs, ended up establishing a national administration. They appointed royal governors all over Upper and Lower Egypt. Please note again that all the dates that you're going to see are approximate. Egyptologists agree on dating, as well as the different Christian faiths agree on doctrine. So around 3100 BC, Narmer unites Upper and Lower Egypt. That's why all the pharaohs wear a crown that is really two crowns in one. The two crowns are seen together first on the Narmer palette, and shows Narmer as the first pharaoh. This slide makes it a bit easier to see the two crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Around 2649 BC and continuing to around 2150 BC, we move into the Old Kingdom period of Egyptian history. It's the age of the pyramid builders. That's what it's most known for. The Pharaoh Khufu, who lived roughly around 2589 BC to 2566 BC, he had the largest of the Giza pyramids built for his tomb. The Great Pyramids were built long before there even was a Jewish people. They preceded Abraham by roughly 400 to 500 years. The Great Pyramids of Giza are the only surviving wonder of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. At some unknown time in Egyptian history, the Giza necropolis, the cemetery for the pharaohs, was abandoned. The Great Sphinx ended up being buried up to its shoulders in sand. And we have the first documented attempt at excavating the site come in around 1400 BC, when the young pharaoh, Thutmose IV, gathered a team and after much effort managed to dig out the front paws of the Great Sphinx. We know this because he placed a granite stab known as the Dream Stele there, and it detailed out his efforts in excavating out the Sphinx. In 1817 AD, the first modern archaeological dig, supervised by the Italian Giovanni Caviglia, uncovered the Sphinx chest completely. There are many tales on how the Sphinx lost its nose. Most of them blame Napoleon's troops and have a story about cannon fire. Drawings of the Sphinx by Frederick Norden in 1758 showed that its nose was even missing then. An Arab historian in the 15th century attributes the loss of the nose to the Sufi Muslims, which he wrote in 1378 AD. The Sunni Muslims found local peasants making offerings to the Sphinx in hopes of increasing their harvest, and therefore he defaced the Sphinx in an act of iconoclasm. The Great Sphinx measures 240 feet long from tail to paw. It's 66 feet high from the base to the top of its head, and it's 62 feet wide at its rear haunches. It's the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt. Around 2150 through 1975 BC was the first period called an intermediate period in Egyptian history. An intermediate period describes a breakdown in central authority and control. Roughly, this time period would be roughly the time of the third and last dynasty of the Sumerians. And our best guess on the date of Abram's birth would be around 2100 BC to somewhere around 1950 BC. So that would put him being born sometime in this time period. During this time period, Egyptian scribes write that there were 70 kings in 70 days. This may be an exaggeration, but it does illustrate the point on what an intermediate period would look like. In 1975 to 1690 BC, we move into the Middle Kingdom period. And again, so we place Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They could all be possibly born into the Middle Kingdom period or the late Old Kingdom period. It's this time period that Egypt develops a well-trained standing army. Improvements are made in irrigation, and they went and they dug out the Old Kingdom period canals. They dredged them open again. While large temple and pyramid complex tomb structures are built, none of the buildings in the Middle Kingdom period have the same massiveness as either the Old Kingdom or the New Kingdom counterparts. But at the same time, over life-size and monumental sculptures, largely depicting pharaohs, come into prolific use. Around 1690 to 1550 BC is the second intermediate period in Egyptian history. Again, there's no centralized authority in Upper Egypt, but in Lower Egypt, a series of outside foreign invaders come in to rule. These foreigners are known as the Hyksos pharaohs, or the Hyksos dynasty. Hyksos Hyksos was an Egyptian term for rulers of foreign lands. The introduction of chariot warfare largely comes in at this period of time in history. From the Old Testament timeline, there's many disagreements on whether Joseph was the vizier of Egypt during this time, or if he was a vizier during the Middle Kingdom period before the second intermediate period. This image shows an image of a Hyksos pharaoh. They successfully took over Egypt and had a succession of 6 kings in power after that, known as the Great Hyksos Pharaohs. The rise of the Hyksos kings in Egypt was generally believed possible by a large influx of immigrants from Canaan into Egypt beginning around 1700 BC to 1550 BC. Most of the Canaanites settled in the eastern portion of the Nile Delta, a land called Goshen by the Hebrews. They achieved a dominant role in trade. Archaeological excavations in that area have revealed a Canaanite-style temple, Canaanite-type burials, including horse burials, Canaanite types of pottery, their superior Bronze Age weapons, a series of Minoan frescoes. The Minoans predate the Greeks. But try to remember that Canaanite is just a word, a Hebrew word describing many different tribes of people living in the land of Canaan. Genesis 47 talks about Joseph talking to Pharaoh about his shepherd brothers coming and settling in Goshen. So it could fit in this time period. Again, no definitive proof either way, but it would fit. Around 1560 BC, the Hyksos are expelled in a rebellion by the local indigenous population. The first pharaoh of what becomes the New Kingdom period of Egypt was Thutmose I. Again, he gets credited for expelling the Hyksos, and he's also the father of a pharaoh that I'm going to talk about more in the next video. During this video, I talked about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, talked about the first pharaoh Narmer, looked a little at the pyramid builders during the Old Kingdom days and the Great Sphinx in a little more detail. We made it through the first intermediate period and then into the Middle Kingdom. We ended the second intermediate period called the Hyksos dynasty. And in the next video, we're going to look at the New Kingdom period. We're going to learn about my favorite pharaoh. We're going to learn about the mummification process and how it evolved over the timeline of Egyptian history. We're going to talk a little bit about the Hebrew patriarchs that were mummified. And then we'll finish with the Nubian period, the Persian period, and the Ptolemaic time period, which Cleopatra is the last pharaoh of. We're going to finish Egyptian history next time with the Rosetta Stone, which is going to sum up how we know all of this wonderful information about the Egyptians. Thanks for watching. Hope you come back.